like to do is we'll have a panel with Dr. Terry Donat, Dr. Monter, and Dr. James. I think he's back in the room. There he is. I know Dr. Monter is heading out for a plane shortly, and so what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce him briefly. He's on the InfraGard board. He's been the CEO of a hospital for roughly 50 years or so. Has been involved with HHS Coordinating Council. He'll explain all of that in the few moments that he has. And he may want to make some initial comments, and then to the extent that he can sit back down and join them for a couple minutes more, you'll understand that he will have to leave to catch a plane because we're a little bit behind time. But Dr. Monter, why don't you begin? And you can either come here or sit there, whichever.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Thanks. Today, I'm sitting here as a retired hospital chief executive officer who was responsible to a board of directors and the community for the safety, security, and resilience of my critical infrastructure, my technology, and my horizontal and vertical people inside the critical infrastructure. I would say to you that hospital CEOs like myself know that there is something like EMP out there, but we don't understand it. And the seminars we've gone to in the past have been technical in terms. And I was lucky enough, as chair of the Health and Public Health sector, in answer to the gentleman from agriculture, yes, some of the 16 sectors are definitely involved. I wrote a grant with the support of Chuck and with the support of Dr. Jim Turbush to do two things. One, to educate healthcare and public health leaders in non-technical terms, in other words, EMP made simple, so that they have a better understanding of what it is. You all know that you have fear of the unknown, but if you were able to educate my peers about this, they will know better how to act. And so we will do a handbook, we will do a website. That's phase one. Phase two, through Chuck's involvement with DITRA, we will be able to fund the assessment of 3 hospitals. Doesn't sound like much, but it's a start, so that we can see and determine whether or not they can achieve at least grid parity, meaning that they would be able to get microgrids, EMP protected, and they would be able to sell electricity back to the utility companies, and the proceeds from that would offset the cost of the microgrids. Now, of course, Chuck, as imaginative as he is, hopes to be able to find money that we can do that without having to worry about grid parity, and hopefully we'll be able to make that happen. But through the courtesy of Deputy Assistant Secretary Bob Kolaski, who works for the Assistant Secretary who was here today, he was able to convince Congressman Hal Rogers to put aside $3 million for 10 challenge grants. Bob previously worked in business and industry and understands the value of challenge grants to people within organizations. And Congressman Rogers went along with that. So there are 10 grants. There's only one related to EMP and healthcare. And thankfully, I always know enough to surround myself with people who know a lot more than I do. And that's why I surround myself with Chuck and with Dr. Jim Turbush. So we have 1 year to be able to provide the workbook, the handbook, the website, and to be able to demonstrate to at least 3 facilities nationwide that it is possible to make this happen. And I know my colleagues well enough that if they see that that's happening and they can do it, why they're gonna be able to hear not too far along from their board of directors. If they're doing it, why can't we be doing it? I like Dr. James's comment about not necessarily hanging our hat on EMP, but the issue of the power outage. Because we're used to, as he indicated, for 72, sometimes 96 hours to be able to survive. But after that, we're in trouble. And if we hang our hat on how are we going to be able to keep our doors open when we have a power outage, it sounds a good thing to me. So I apologize for having to run away, but I wanted you to know the good news that one of the 16 sectors doesn't have, in fact, a grant. There's experts in the booth, and we intend to make this happen. Thank you.
My name is Terry Donat, and I'm a sector chief for the infrastructure program in Chicago, as well as I co-chair the healthcare industry advisory group for the EMP SEG with Jim Turler from Colorado. One of the things that I got involved in this a few years ago was as an emergency manager, and looking at not just EMP, but electricity and infrastructure support for hospitals. You know, as a surgeon, which I do on a daily basis, I can't do what I do without a whole cadre of people that have been around and supplying the infrastructure or equipment for the supplies. People always sort of give me the quizzical eyebrow lift or sort of a head dog, a dog's head shape, wondering why medicine has to do with security, particularly national security. And I'm just, you know, if with walls and guns and guards, I would agree with that. But I think medicine and it's a bit more than that. It's if you define security more as the intelligence, the situational awareness, and the coordinated actions that give a survival advantage to whether it's the individual or the community. I think that's what you really have in medicine on a daily basis. And so, you know, when we look at who's attending these events, you know, Jim Francis here is a dentist from Pennsylvania. We don't have any veterinarians in the crowd, but I'm sure we will going forward and using the agricultural importance in security. And myself in medicine, I think one of the big things we realize is that medicine is not just on the backside of anything, it's on the foresight, and that you can't preserve those capabilities as security capabilities if you don't address the infrastructure. One of the things in looking at what this panel is about is assessment for microgrids for hospitals or capabilities for hospitals. And although Jim James and I talked a bit and Earl talked about those capabilities, one of the things I want to mention was in looking at an assessment, one of the things I think gets completely left out of most hospital exercises is loss of communication. Hospital communications is very strongly either internally secure, provided they have power, or externally it's always based upon infrastructure communications through either fiber optic lines, internet lines, or other means. The only really radio communications you have is with EMS. But if I was to ask one thing of anyone in this room to do when they go back to their local communities and assess resilience in their hospital is ask your hospital to, with every capability intact, all power, all water, all supply lines, pharmaceuticals, and all their staff, communicate with how would you communicate with your staff externally, with other agencies externally, or other hospitals, or supply companies in the absence of infrastructure communications? And I think you would start to see some links there. So those are actually very easy things to surmount, whether it's amateur radio or other non-amateur infrastructure-based communications, both the local level, state level, and the national level for shares. But I think one of the things I would impart to you, because as Jim and I were talking, a lot of these conferences we tend to revisit the same issues. We're not talking about what should I do when I go home. That would be one thing I would impart to you immediately. I think one of the big problems in medicine that medicine has a hard time wrapping its head around dealing with loss of electrical power. We are so not only so reliant on it to do our daily work, but we believe that it will always be there. And we also believe that it will be there for our families when we go to work. and when we go home, because we're very infrastructure fixed-based facility in general, except for EMS. So that lends us to believe that we tend to focus on our own locality and our own facilities. We tend not to look at how infrastructure impacts or loss of impact, infrastructure impacts those things. Secondary thing is that in trying to comply with things like the new emergency preparedness directive from CMS, whereupon our emergency preparedness efforts are contingent on us getting and participating and getting paid through CMS. What happens, the emergency managers and hospital administrators very much focus on the details of their fine processes rather than the large impacts that could affect them externally in the hospital. Other initiatives that really draw our attention are things like antibiotics. There's a lot of time and effort being dedicated to those things, and they're important, but they will be very little if you have loss of infrastructure to supply the hospital to do its basic capabilities. And then I think one of the things I wanted to mention, I've been very lucky to be able to support Chuck and Earl Messer through the InfoGuard program and the coordinating committee, and James in running and having forums in which to look at these issues. One of the things I wanted to mention, Dr. Metzer had to leave, but the sector coordinating committee is the private sector side primarily for EHS coordinating activities along with the government coordinating committee. And through the sector-specific plan which was developed last year, healthcare is the only sector apart from energy that mentions space weather and other grid threat activities or grid threats that could affect it. So currently we're the only two sectors that have those plans or recommendations for planning in those guidance documents, which we've been very fortunate to have, primarily through the efforts of knowing what Bill Murtaugh from the Space Weather Prediction Center was working on with the White House prior to him actually starting and initiating that. So that's been very successful. Two other things I wanted to mention. So last year, James asked me to develop a tabletop scenario that we ran through the Society for Disaster Medicine and Public Health and the people in here in Rockville. And we did that this past July. And some of the things that came out, we ran a tabletop scenario with a space weather event impacting most of the eastern connection and then the area around Seattle, much akin to the predictions that Meditech had for those stable for the vulnerable transformers at 50 degrees. And then we also put in, at the end of the first week, an opportunistic attack upon large transformer fields that would have increased the area affected. And we were fortunate enough to have Margaret Dunn, who was from, at that time, a Georgetown University intern at War College from Pennsylvania, down to talk about some studies they had looked at. What would happen with just diabetics in the first week and the first month of not having access to insulin or having access to electricity and refrigeration. And what you see is that almost all major diabetics, certainly all the type 1s and most of the type 2, meaning they're insulin dependent versus non-insulin dependent, they can take other medications. Most of them don't survive more than 34 days, and that ends up being millions of people in the eastern half of the country. And so you're looking at dramatic impacts very quickly. Also, we had Kristen Fine there from Health and Human Services, because there are lots of GIS resources where individual counties or towns or states can look at who are the vulnerable people who are energy dependent, whether it's oxygen, hemodialysis, insulin pumps, or other medical devices. And that's going to be increased with the Internet of Things, as well as the push that has been made over the last decade to get people out of the acute care facility into the community for their care. So those people, when they run out of power, they end up coming to hospitals, and hospitals in general don't have enough electrical capacity. They do it in actual wattage, but they don't in actual wattage. The things that we really realized out of that were, number one, communications would be a big problem because you can't coordinate, you don't know what your situation really was. The other thing is that maintaining a staff after the first week is going to be virtually impossible in most major urban settings. Not just because of lack of transportation, but people's ability to deal with what's happening with their own responsibilities with their families and with their neighbors, and those requirements. And so pretty much after the first week, things go south primarily in healthcare. The last thing is, while right now, for instance, we can do, I can some plastic surgeons, I'm sure he does some cosmetic industry and other things. We have the mainstay of what disease is in this country has been not wiped out, but really tainted. So that we can deal with where the aesthetic things beyond our needs of what we have to do for medical care. One of the things we realized is that within a week, especially with things like diabetes, the natural history of disease gets revisited upon the population that has been affected, meaning when you don't have the way to medically intervene, hypertension, strokes, trauma, diabetes, all those things, the natural history of what happens to people comes to bear very quickly within the time span. There's no way to mitigate those things or even support those people in the long care. So what I really would say is that in looking at this, it's encourage, if you get the chance, encourage any hospital administrators to come in contact with to look at this only because in a time of need, the hospital administrators and medical staff are going to be affected along with their families just like everybody else. And so to not have plans in place, and I would especially urge alternative communications plans because you really can't start anything coordinated without doing that. Thank you.
No, you can wrap up.
I have a couple of things, but it'll take about 2 hours. I don't want to start coughing again, that's embarrassing. I really prefer question and answer, but I just want to point out one article in our journal, which was tools and checklists used for the evaluation of hospital disaster preparedness, a systematic review. It was a very thorough review of all the literature, looking at all the criteria for testing hospital readiness. Electricity was mentioned, one word, one punch. All right? And everything on sustainability has to do with 3 days. So there's a tremendous amount of work to do. There's an organization called JACO. They do accreditation of 80% of U.S. hospitals. If you want to get hospitals to pay attention, you need to work through JACO creating requirements. And why did they listen to JACO? Because without the accreditation, they don't get Medicare reimbursement. I'd rather open it up to questions.
We have time for one question if you have a microphone, but if there's no microphone, there'll be no question. Can I ask a question? Come on. Highest bidder, $10, $20. Sold, $20. Okay. One question, that's it.
A couple of quick questions. You mentioned the history.
Identify yourself.
Bill Reuter, submarine officer. You mentioned the history of things that would repeat, like hypertension. How about cholera? How about typhus? How about typhoid?
Right.
Things like that that also are lurking in the woodwork.
Sure, without a doubt. While I was talking about the things that we've painted, we're very lucky to have a lot of parasites and waterborne diseases in this country because of the specific preparation and mitigation to take. Those will all come back, of course.
Now, you're all welcome to stay for the next steps conversation because at least some of these people will be here because we'll be here all the way till 5:30, as you can see in your program, so you'll have opportunity for more questions. But I just wanted to thank them because many folks in the country have never been inside the control room of a nuclear power plant or an ISP or a data center, but everyone's been in a hospital or walked by one, right? So if we can get this concept in the minds of the folks in hospitals and have people see how hospitals can become sustainable because they make 20-30% of their own power and store it locally so they can stay open indefinitely instead of closing their doors when we need them most, they can then say, well, if the hospitals can do it, why can't my institution do it? So they're one of the top infrastructure plays anyway. But from the standpoint of an icon, they are the great American icon, and you guys are just that. So thank you very much for being here today.